Um, if you haven't noticed thus far, we're going to be spending this quarter talking about the book of Revelation. I'll tell you right up front, this is one of my favorite books of the Bible. I love talking about this. I love studying this book. That's one of the reasons why I'm teaching this here tonight. I've taught this a couple times. Hopefully I'm getting better as we get going, so I hope I can teach you something this quarter. So tonight, we're going to talk about Lesson 1. Lesson 1 is really going to be an intro to the book of Revelation, and early on in the class, there'll be an introduction to this quarter, and how the structure is going to go, what our approach is going to be, and really how we're going to tackle the book of Revelation. But before we get into that, I've asked Kevin if he'd lead us in a prayer. So Kevin, would you go ahead and do that, please? So as I'm sure most of you know, whether you're familiar with the book of Revelation or not, you probably are familiar with the fact that this is not your typical book of the Bible. At first glance, it's very different. It takes on a very different style and a different approach to writing than most of the other books of the Bible, especially the other books of the New Testament. So since this is not a typical book of the Bible like the others, this is not going to be a typical Bible class. We're not going to start at the very beginning and make our way chronologically all the way to the end. We're going to skip around a little bit. We're going to pull bits from here, bits from there, and piece it together. My reason for doing this I want to share with you tonight. I want you to think back to the last time you took an English class. For me, that was high school. Some of you, that may have been high school, maybe it was college, whatever. Think back to the stories and the books that they would give you to read in those classes. For me, I remember books like Iliad and the Odyssey. Hated it. Books like Animal Farm. Hated it. 1984. Hated it. I don't really like to read very much, if you can't tell. Didn't like any of those books because they didn't make sense to me. They went right over my head, despite the approach that the teachers tried to get us to understand at that time. I understand the approach a little bit better now, and we're going to use the approach from our English class on this book. What do we typically do when we get a book in our English class? What does the teacher typically assign us to do before we ever open the book, before we ever start reading it? Research the author. What else? Okay, you peruse through the book, see what kinds of things you're going to be seeing. You establish who the characters are, what their motives are. Correct, the historical context of the book, and all of those things we look at, because if it's a book that we're not familiar with, if it's a style or a time period that we're not familiar with, looking at those things ahead of time help us when we open the book. At the point that we get to page 1 and start reading it through, we understand it a little better. We're more familiar with some of the visions and the words that are used. And that's what the approach that we're going to take to this class. We're going to spend about 5 weeks, roughly, setting the stage, talking about the characters, the style, the historical context of this book, really setting the stage so that when we get to those next few weeks, we can look at the story, and the story it'll be much easier for us to piece it together, and it'll make a lot more sense to us. And then once we've gone through the story, we're going to spend 2 to 3 weeks on application. If you'll look in your book, you'll see kind of a schedule layout of the lessons. You will notice there are fewer lessons than we have weeks. I did that intentionally. Some of them may spill over a little bit. I also plan at the end of the quarter, if there's time, to have maybe a question and answer class. We may expand our discussion about false doctrines, other things like that. So we've got some room to work with the schedule, but that was intentional. Before I really get into lesson 1, I'll take this opportunity as well to tell you a little bit about the book. If you have done lesson 1 and you've read through the beginning of the book, you'll already know this. But the way the book is structured is each lesson will have pre-class preparation that'll consist of some questions for thought and a reading from the book of Revelation for you to do. I hope that you'll do that before you get here. Try not to do it sitting in the pew 10 minutes before class because you're not really going to get much out of it. Try to do it ahead of time. It's really going to make our discussion a lot easier because some nights we may not read the text in class. I may have expected you to do it beforehand, and it's really going to make things go faster, which we need to be able to do in a book that's this heavy. And then there's an in-class notes. The in-class notes may be a little different than you're used to. I'm not going to put question 1 up on the board and discuss it, question 2, discuss it. The point of the in-class notes are really just to help guide you through the discussion. I hope that you'll read at least the questions before you come. Maybe not answer them, but at least read the questions. They're really just intended to help point out the important points of class, help you draw out the important things that are going to help make it make sense to you. So now we're going to go ahead and get into lesson number 1. Like I've said, Revelation's a very different book. It can be a very confusing book to people, especially if it's your first time going through it. However, there are some principles that are going to help us to put this puzzle together. There's some principles that are going to help us unlock some of the mystery of this book. And if we allow these principles to guide us through our study, which we will, it's really going to make things easier. And I think you'll find that these 4 things we're going to discuss tonight will really help you in your approach to studying Revelation, talking to other people about Revelation, and so forth. So to unlock the mystery of Revelation, we're going to look at the 4 keys tonight. These 4 keys are audience, background, time frame, and style. We're going to talk about each of these 4 things, and we're really going to focus on these 4 things through the entire quarter, but especially tonight and the next couple weeks. We're going to talk about each one in a little bit more detail. The first key, audience. Revelation has a very specific audience. John, who is writing this book, makes it very clear who he is writing to. In verse 1, he says he's writing to the bondservants. In verse 4 of chapter 1, he says to the 7 churches that are in Asia Minor more specifically. And then in verse 11, he lists those 7 churches whom he's speaking to: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Like we just saw in verse 4, John says that he's writing to the 7 churches. You skip all the way to the last chapter, in chapter 22, verse 16. He says, I, Jesus is speaking here, have sent my angel to testify to these things for the churches, these 7 churches. From cover to cover, Revelation was written for these churches. We cannot forget this fact as we study this book. However we interpret the imagery, however we interpret the visions and the text that we're going to look at, it has to be with a view towards whom it was written. The message must mean something to these people for John to be writing it to them. So to interpret it ourselves, we have to keep that in mind. We're going to talk about the audience a lot more in the next 2 weeks, so we're not going to discuss much more of that tonight. In fact, I'm going to be out next week. Stephen's going to be covering for me, and he's going to continue the discussion of the audience, and then I'll continue it more when we get back. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and skip to key number 2, but expect more about the audience later. Key number 2, background. There is a very important historical background to the book of Revelation. There's a unique set of circumstances that exist here. And in fact, these circumstances are what gave rise to the writing of the book. Revelation was written around the year 96 AD. Now, I have an alternate date listed up there. There's some speculation about which of these two dates it is, or which of these two dates the book was written in. There's also some people that have other dates between the two. It really doesn't matter. Let me say that up front. So if you're an early dater and I'm a late dater, it's okay. It won't change the message. Okay? These dates and all of these dates people give, they're so close together, it's really not going to change the point of the message. So don't worry. But for me, I personally believe the book was written in 96 AD. John says in chapter 1 he's writing from the island of Patmos. If you know anything about Patmos, it's an exile island. It's kind of like a prison. I'd think of it as kind of like a first century Alcatraz. It's somewhere where you were exiled, where you were sent if you were an outcast of society, and you really weren't allowed to come back. Most people who went to Patmos went once and spent the rest of their days there. And though it's not written in the Bible, there are some secular writings that believe John was sent to Patmos in 94 AD, 92 to 94. Can't confirm those, obviously. That's why I say I can't confirm that 96 is the correct date, because it obviously wasn't given to us. But, again, it's not that important that we know an exact date. But I say all that to make this point. You may hear me reference the emperor of the times, and I may say the name Domitian, who was the emperor in 96 in that time. And again, if I do that, you can replace Nero, who was emperor in 68. It's okay. Don't get tripped up on those things. But anyways, the historical context of both of these dates, especially 96, is going to be the same. During this time, Christians were facing intense persecution at the hands of the empire. And in 96, this is Domitian, like I said. Domitian here is the emperor. We see hints of trouble found through chapter 1 and through the rest of the book, of course. But in chapter 1 and verse 9, John mentions the tribulation that the people are suffering. John mentions tribulation. He mentions perseverance, and these are words that imply that something difficult is going on. And John himself is a prisoner for the gospel. So, of course, as we move into the book, we find more and more evidence that we're going to continue to look at of a great battle taking place, of different sides opposing each other. This is kind of a theme that we're going to see throughout the book. It's some kind of battle. Revelation was written during a time of violent persecution against God's people. Persecution started with the church very early on. We see it in Acts chapter 4. You see the Jews were persecuting Christians, and really at this time, Christians were seen kind of as just another sect of the Jews, just a group similar to the Jews. But even from early on, there was this persecution. The persecution of Christians really intensified around 64 AD. At this time, there was a fire in Rome. Rome went through a fire. It was very, very troublesome time. A lot of damage took place, and accusations started getting thrown around as to who was responsible for this fire. And being already outcasts and kind of viewed with suspicion, Christians became the easy scapegoat and became accused of being responsible for this fire. And a lot of people will accuse Nero of doing this because people started looking at Nero, who was the emperor. They started pointing fingers at him and blaming him, so he found the next person in line who should take the blame, and that was Christians. And that's really when persecution of Christians really took off and really set forth a pattern that would continue over many years and would only get worse. Now, here we are about 30 years later in 96, where our emperor, again, Domitian took this persecution beyond any other emperor that we can see, arguably. Domitian took very seriously the notion that the emperor was a god. At this time, this had been something that had been around for a while, this thought of elevating the emperor above everyone else. Domitian took it to a whole new level. Domitian, all throughout the world, set up images of himself, proclaimed that he was a god and that people were to worship him. In all of the world at this time, you were to worship Domitian as a god, otherwise you were an outcast. You were considered an atheist if you didn't believe that Domitian was a god. You were a traitor to the empire. There was an official body of people responsible for building these images, for enforcing emperor worship, and punishing those people who didn't. Now, as you can imagine, this presents a problem for someone who's a Christian. If I'm a Christian and I serve Jesus, I serve God, I can't have Domitian be a god. I can't worship God. I think we all understand that's a problem. But we have to consider what was happening to these people. It wasn't a matter of just walking outside and saying, nah, Domitian's not my God. I'm going to go about my business. That didn't work. Christians were labeled as traitors, as I said. They were disloyal to Rome because they wouldn't serve Domitian or worship Domitian. And their punishment took many forms. I want to share with you a story. I'll tell you up front, the story is a little graphic. But I do this because I want you to understand what's happening at this time and what these people were going through. I read this. It was a letter a man wrote. I don't know the man's name. I don't know whether he was a Christian or what, but he was writing to somebody else telling them about what was happening in his city, which was obviously under the Roman Empire's control. He said that the Roman Empire found a man who refused to worship Domitian, and they decided to do something about it, as they were doing with many people. They took this man out into a public square, maybe a coliseum, and invited the whole town, every city around, to come and watch. This was a public spectacle. And they told this man, you have to worship Domitian. He is your God, and you're going to worship him. He said no. They said, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. They brought his wife out, and out of the furnace, they pulled a white-hot iron chair and chained his wife to it and told him, worship Domitian. He said, no, I can't do that. It's not going to happen. They said, okay. They brought out his children. They did the same thing to his children. Imagine having to watch that. And they told him, here's what's happening. Worship Domitian. He said, no, can't do that. So they took it further. They began cutting pieces of flesh off of his children, cooking it and feeding it to the animals that were nearby. Worship Domitian, or this is what happens to you. This was a message to that man. And out of that, his wife died, his kids died. He didn't. They let him go free. Make sure everyone knew you are going to worship the empire. The empire is number one, not God. That's what these people were having to go through. Revelation was written at a time when it truly cost something to be a disciple. Your life was on the line. Your life was difficult. Now, maybe not every single person was having their life threatened every single day, but it definitely wasn't easy. Imagine coming home to your family being hungry because you went out to try to buy food and people said, no, you're one of those Christians. We can't do business with you, or we'll get in trouble. They wouldn't do business with them. Imagine standing in one of those situations. You can't buy food. You can't find a job. What do? You can't live your life. All because you refuse to worship this man because he thinks he's a god. Revelation was written at a time when disciples had a key choice to make. Were they going to stay strong and worship God and follow Jesus, or were they going to give in? Were they going to let their life be easier by worshiping Domitian and following the empire? It was a difficult time. This is what these Christians were facing every single day. You know, we read verses like in Revelation 2:10 in the address to Smyrna, where Jesus says to that church, be faithful unto death. He's not just saying, be faithful for the rest of your life until you die, even though that is the point. What he's really telling these people is, be faithful even in the face of death, which may come tomorrow. Someone may be killing you because you are faithful. Be faithful. This was a serious matter that these people were facing. And so, as we start looking at the book of Revelation, who is written to these people, who John's talking in chapter 1 about the tribulation that they're going through, the perseverance that they have to have through the difficulties they're going through, doesn't it make sense that John's talking about this situation, with them struggling against the empire, with them struggling to make their lives work in this world that's so broken? When we read of Christians suffering, does it not just make sense to assume we're talking about them suffering at the hands of Domitian? When we read of great battles and beasts waging war against one another, does it not make sense that it might have something to do with this spiritual war that's going on around them? When we read of tribulation, does it not make sense to assume it's about these people whom John has said is his audience? A lot of people in the world today try to strip all of this meaning away from the book. They try to make application to this book that takes it completely away from the audience, completely out of this historical context, and make it about something different. Men have no right to do that. John makes it clear who he's writing to. John's talking to these people about the situation they're going through. So we have to keep that in mind. As we start getting further into the book, as we start making interpretation about the meaning behind these things, we have to consider the background, the situation that these people are facing. And we will talk more about that in the next couple weeks as well. Key number 3, time frame. Revelation is a book of prophecy. John makes that very clear. He describes events that he says will take place in the future. The question is, how far in the future? Verse 19, John says, Jesus says to John, therefore write the things which ye have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. John is going to be writing about what's to come. Again, a lot of people in the world try to make application and try to make interpretations that go outside of this time frame, things that aren't happening soon, as John might say. The problem with all of these theories is that they ignore time frame. John says these things must take place soon. John says the time is near. All the way at the end of the book, it says that these are things which must shortly take place. Now, if you're familiar with any teachings from the book of Revelation out in the world, a lot of them, people say, are still happening today. That even today, things from this book are being fulfilled, and we're seeing these events happen. We're seeing seals from chapter 5 or 6 and 7 being opened and these sorts of things. But are these things taking place soon? If they're taking place soon, how can we say 2,000 and something years later is still soon? Another statement is made in the last chapter that I want to focus on for a second. In chapter 22, verse 10, John is told, "Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near." That's an important phrase, and the reason for that is we see that phrase at another point in our Bibles. If we look back to the book of Daniel, Daniel is also given some prophecies. The prophecies will look very similar. We'll see very similar visions. And go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 8, because I want you to see this. I'm going to have my wife, Elena, read this for me. I like her version of this, her version of the Bible there. Chapter 8 and verse 26. Elena, can you read that? Think about the contrast between those two statements, okay? John is told in Revelation, "Do not seal up the words of this prophecy, because the time is near." Daniel, on the other hand, after given a prophecy, is told, "Seal this up, because these things are happening well into the future. Seal it up. It's not needed right now. Hold on to it for when it is needed." Those two things are in direct contrast to one another. Does anyone know how long it was from when Daniel received his vision to when that vision was fulfilled? No, it was longer than 12 years. From the full fulfillment of this prophecy. Daniel received this prophecy in about 570 BC. The complete fulfillment of the prophecy was finished when the Macedonian Empire split in 168 BC. So we're looking here at about 400 years from everything in this prophecy being completed. 400 years, roughly, is a long time and is not soon, and for that reason, seal those words up. But now people come to Revelation where it says these things are soon. Don't seal it up and say, well, it must be happening 2,000 years in the future. Why? That's not consistent. That's very inconsistent. Do what? It must be. It's some kind of new math that they've made sense to themselves. But that being said, I don't want to stand here and claim we can put some specific by-year time frame on the book of Revelation and the things that come out of it. Not going to do that. Have no desire to try to do that. But what I'm saying is that the things that came out of Daniel's prophecy, I think the things that come out of Revelation must happen much sooner. Regardless of how long Daniel's was, this has to happen soon. Some people try to escape implications of this by pointing to 2 Peter 3:8. You're going to hear that if you talk to people about this enough. People will say, but to God, 1,000 years is but a day, and a day 1,000 years. So that means that soon is not at all the same thing. Yeah, it's a good point. If this is the case, why give a time frame at all? This book wasn't for God's benefit. It was for the church's benefit. Think about what's being said here in the book. I know that you're going through this difficult time. I know that you're struggling. I know you're facing all these terrible things. Some of you are dying, but don't worry, help is coming, but none of you will see it. How does that message help? What good does that message do? That's why Daniel was told, seal this up. Don't tell people about this. It's not happening yet. Here in Revelation, these people received this letter. They're being read this, that help is going to come. Something is going to be done about this injustice. and they're going to see it. Many of these people are going to see these things come about. That's the comfort of the message. It wouldn't make sense for it to be outside of that time frame. Again, many people claim that the visions of Revelation describe events that some of them still haven't even happened yet, according to some people. We still may be thousands of years away from them. There are a lot of books out in the world that you can see people trying to link this chapter of Revelation happened in the year 2014. And they try to link it to events. You can't do that. That is a gross misuse of this book. And we can't do that. We have to remember the time frame. We have to remember the background. We have to remember the audience. With these things in mind, it will help us to help this book make a lot more sense. And we'll be able to approach the false doctrines and things that we're going to face in the world. I'm going to take a second here. Does anybody have any comments, questions? No. Maybe I misspoke. Let me clarify that. Revelation did not happen before Daniel happened. I'm just comparing the time frames. When Daniel happened, it said that those things were far out in the future. Now, at a completely different time in history, we have something that we're comparing to it. Revelation is much shorter compared to back when Daniel and the writings of Daniel took place. Thanks for making that clarification. Anything else? Yeah. That's correct, yeah. So thank you for pointing ahead to my table of contents. Please don't hear me say this book has no meaning to us at all, okay? Because it definitely does. But really, just to understand, before we can apply it to ourselves, we have to understand how it applied to them and the message that would apply. So, and Hugh is right. Lesson 10, we're going to talk about how this book can apply to us and what things we can draw from it. That's a great point about the message, and we're going to see a little bit more of that as we get into our fourth key. If there are no more comments, we're going to go ahead and go into the fourth key here. Revelation has a very specific style. Now, this, I think, is one that's probably most obvious to everyone who looks at this book. It's very different. The first thing we typically notice about this book is Revelation is filled with bizarre, striking figures. You've got beasts and dragons and angels, bloody wars. This is a very unique thing that we don't really see too many other places in the Bible. We really don't see it in the New Testament. Daniel and some others in the Old Testament have very similar styles at certain points. But all of that being said, this can be a very intimidating book because of the style, if we don't understand it. This shouldn't be a surprise to us. At the very opening of the book, John tells us that Things are going to be different. John says, these are the things which were signified to me, and now John is signifying it to the people. These are signs, symbols. There's a significant importance to these things. It's going to be different. Let's not go into this thinking it's not. It is different. It tells a message communicated very differently than the rest of the Bible. I like the idea of Revelation being a divine picture book, because that's really what's going on here, is these pictures and these images are being drawn for these people, and details are being thrown in to make these very vivid images for these people to see that convey a message. Obviously, the thing to be avoided is to be too literal. Now, that's something we're going to talk about probably almost every week, is not being too literal with things. Many of the people who abuse this book float back and forth. This verse is literal, this verse is not, this word is, this is not, and they pick and choose things to piece together this message that they want to tell. We can't do that. This is self-serving, and it is a wrong approach to the book. Now, I don't mean to imply that nothing is to be understood literally. John is a very real person, writing to a very real group of people. These are real churches he's writing to. But as we move into visions, like we're going to see here in a second in chapter 1, we have to recognize the symbolism and the intention behind that, and work to interpret it as symbolism. Revelation has a specific style, and this style has a name. This is apocalyptic literature. This is a certain type of style. This isn't just randomly thrown together in some weird format. There's reason behind this. There's purpose to this style. This style is used in other places. Like I said, some places in the Bible, but there are secular writings, especially from this time, that are written in a very similar style, apocalyptic. The reason that we tend to struggle with making Revelation make sense to us is because apocalyptic literature is not something that we typically read every day. Most of the articles we pull up on Facebook are not going to be written in apocalyptic literature. We don't see it very much. Keep in mind, a man who had never encountered poetry before might think some poems were a little weird when he started reading them. It's just something that's unfamiliar to us. It's not all random. It's written a specific way for a specific reason. We see this style used in very specific historical settings. There are a lot of secular writings out there. Not going to read any of them, obviously, but the Book of Enoch, the Assumption of Moses are just two titles that I know of that are written in this same style. Writers would typically use apocalyptic style during times of oppression and suffering. They used it to signify those things. It was typically when it was used. Times when people were being pushed down, beaten upon by some superior power. We see it in the Bible, like I said, in Daniel. God's people were being oppressed by the Babylonians. Again, like I said, there are other secular writings. Like I said, Book of Enoch, Assumption of Moses, Antiochus Epiphanes. I said that correctly. Antiochus Epiphanes was a terrible persecutor of the Jews. Somebody wrote about that and the oppression that those people were going through. Again, though those are not part of the Bible, they employ a very similar style. And if you'll notice kind of the description that I used on a lot of those, the writings were really written about times that were very similar to the background we just talked about. People going through very difficult oppression from a greater power. It's easy to see how apocalyptic literature fits very well with the times and what's being written about here. It makes sense that apocalyptic literature was used. The people in these churches that this was written to were probably familiar with apocalyptic literature. Like I said, a lot of secular writings, as well as some Old Testament writings. This was something they would have been familiar with, probably in the same way we're familiar with poetry or similar things. Apocalyptic books had an agenda, typically. They would allude to the present distress. They would also point to a glorious future and deliverance from the oppression that was being faced. In this situation, we're going to see deliverance from the Roman Empire, deliverance by God for God's people. The triumph would come as a result of God's intervention on behalf of his people. And we will see judgment upon the enemies. This style may have been necessary at times like these. I've heard it described that the book of Revelation is sometimes used to both reveal and conceal a message. Let me clarify what that means. To those who understood the style and the images that were being used, this message could come alive in a very unique way. It would be a very vivid message. It could very well get the point across. But at the same time, those who didn't understand the style or didn't understand the symbols being used, it would strike them probably the way our first impression was, just a lot of confusion. I don't think it's difficult to see the value in this. If a Christian was walking around with a letter and a Roman Empire stopped him and that letter said Jesus is going to punish Rome for the terrible things that they're doing to his people, based on the background and the context of history, do you not think that Christian is going to get in trouble? Probably. Most likely. But if he's caught with a letter that says the Lamb will cast the sea beast and the false prophet into the lake of fire and brimstone, it may take a little more thought to get to the meaning of that. Christian walks on his way, not getting in trouble, hopefully. I'm not saying they were all walking around with this letter in their pocket getting caught with it, but for most other people who might walk by and hear Christians being read this letter or reading this letter, they're not going to think much about it. It's not instantly understood if you're not familiar with it. So again, we need to get moving, but just understand we're playing catch up with this style of literature, and we're actually going to do a quick usage of this literature. We're going to look at chapter 1. We've already looked a little bit at chapter 1, John talking about the time frame and tribulation and things like that, but there is actually a vision in chapter 1 that I want you to see with me. In chapter 1, I'm going to start reading in verse 12. What I want you to do while I'm reading this is picture this in your head. Okay? Visualize the things that I'm reading, and afterwards, I want you to pick one word that describes what you see. One word that describes the vision here. Starting in verse 12. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the middle of the lampstands, I saw one like a son of man, clothed in a robe, reaching to the feet, and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white, like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze when it had been made to glow in a furnace. And his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held the 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp, 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun, shining in its strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man, and he placed his right hand on me, saying, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last." What's your one word? Awesome. Great word. What else? Power. Any others? Overwhelming. Any other words? Glorious. Glorious, same word? Yeah. Y'all took all my words. I don't have any to tell you. Who is this? Jesus. Right off the bat, a couple people said it. It's Jesus. We know that because of a couple of reasons. 17, I am the first and the last. There are a few more things we're not going to read immediately. You'll also see a lot of these references in lessons 2 and 3 when we talk more about the audience. Again, I'm just going to go through this real fast because we're out of time. But what we see here is Jesus with, in his hand, 7 stars. He's standing amongst lampstands. John tells us at the end of the chapter what this means. He says, in his hands are the angels overlooking the churches. Around him, the lampstands are the churches. Now, we're not going to get bogged down in details. 1, we're at a time. 2, we don't need to. What's the point? Jesus, standing amongst his churches, in his hand the power to overlook and control their situation. And this message is powerful. It's awesome. It's overwhelming that despite all of this situation they're going through, all of the difficulty, the tribulation, the perseverance that they're trying to keep with, Jesus is with them. Jesus is in control. And quite frankly, this is a really cool way to see Jesus being with you and in control. It's a very vivid image if we'll spend time looking at it. So we're out of time. These 4 keys need to stay with you. They're important. We're going to use them every single week, and we have to keep them in mind if we're going to accurately interpret the things of this book. And we'll talk about them in more detail, so pardon the quick cutoff here at the end of class. Thanks for listening.